It's said that COVID cases are climbing all over the world. Is that actually the case? And I'm going to tell you the one question you really need to be asking of your doctor or healthcare provider if you have tested positive for COVID. Come on, let's find out what I'm talking about. Hello everyone, Dr. Chris Martinson here. It's December 1st, 2020, and we're going to be talking about the PCR tests which are used to detect for COVID or SARS-CoV-2 presence. SARS-CoV-2, the virus, COVID is the disease. So let's be clear about that. All right, this is everything you need to know. There's a little bit of context here, but let's be very clear. Here's the one big question we have to ask. What does the PCR COVID test actually tell us? What is it actually telling us? So when you get a test for COVID or for SARS-CoV-2, you'd want to be telling you certain things. Here's what I'd want it to be telling me. First, am I infectious? That is, if I test positive, what should I do about that? Do I need to begin treatment right away? Should I isolate myself from my family? That would be something that a test ought to really answer for you is, are you infectious? You want to know who is infectious, right? So if people are testing positive all over town or in your building, you'd like to know, well, is that meaningful, right? Are they actually infectious? Now, you would think that a positive test would mean that you are infectious, but that's not actually the case when it comes to the tests that we're using, and I'm going to explain that for you because it's important to understand that for public health policy experts and for individuals like yourself. All right, another question. We would like to know, well, this positive test, does that mean I'm going to develop COVID, the disease? You know, that's something that actually I think we could tell from the test, but it's not being used that way really right now, at least not in the public sphere. And we would like to know, where is the virus actively spreading? That would be a really important thing to know because then you have better chances at containing it. So these are what we'd like a COVID test to tell us. Now let's go into a little bit about what this test is. And we're going to have to use a term. It's called the cycle threshold, and I'm going to explain it. I went over this on September 1st. I went over it back in March sometime, I think. But we're going to go over it one more time because it's really important because a lot of your life and our lives are being shaped by the results of these tests, so we ought to know this stuff. All right, the one question that you should be asking your healthcare provider after you test positive is, at what cycle threshold did my test return that positive? Let me explain what that means. It's a really, really critical question. Now, first up, before we get there, we're going to answer that question. But first, this is case counts in the United States. Obviously, huge second wave, ginormous increase in cases, and it's really terrifying according to the media. And first question we would ask, is that actually the case? So maybe not. We don't know yet because of this subtlety we're going to talk about in terms of the testing. This begins to explain it a little bit here. This is for the UK, and looking at targeted tested only, estimated 100,000 cases per day at peak. But you notice right over here, let me get my drawing tool back up. Here's where mass testing became available. And so there's lots of tests being run here. There weren't that many tests being run back here, back in the bad old days of February, March, and April during that so-called first wave. The reason that, again, obviously only people who were showing up at hospitals very sick were getting tested. Now a lot more people are being tested, so mass testing is available. Okay, they had targeted testing only, and now it's mass testing. So we can't really compare these two numbers, but we really have to understand this mass testing because it's being used to drive a lot of decisions. In the UK, they're entering second lockdowns and huge economic damage, especially for small businesses. This is true in the United States. Here's a sampling of headlines from the United States. Massachusetts, that's my state, small businesses that are open dropped 37%. About a third of New Jersey's small businesses have closed so far this year. 13 local bars and restaurants. You're going to see hundreds and hundreds of news returns like that if you go to search local results in Google. But comprehensively, Yelp data shows that 60% of business closures due to the coronavirus pandemic thing here are permanent. This is a really, really large impact. So if public health policy people are saying cases are rising and therefore we have to implement lockdowns, these lockdowns have real impacts. So here's one impact that just came up last week. Let's tune in on this real quick. This is in Ontario, up in Canada. This is a business owner This guy's the barbecue owner, Adam Skelly. He's arrested by police because he refused to shut his business down. He refused to lose his livelihood. And shame. You know, what's interesting to me is seeing how unconcerned these Canadian police are that somebody's going to hurt them in some way. They turn their backs on the crowd. In the United States, this would all be pepper spray, maybe drawn guns. But very interesting to watch the behaviors there. But this is what's happening. People's lives are being actively destroyed. Their business lives, their economic opportunities, all of that. And so you'd want to know, from a public policy perspective, you need to know, are we doing the right things? And by the way, again, just to be clear, I think that this virus is a very bad thing and I don't want it. But I would especially not want to have it if I hadn't prepared my terrain. I think that once you prepare your terrain, the amounts of deaths and the amount of long haulers and the amount of impacts and the amount of people showing up in hospitals, all of those things would decline very, very dramatically if we had an appropriate outpatient treatment program that would include vitamin D, selenium, ivermectin of all things, the drug which shall not be named, Duizibin, at a very early stage for that stuff. But ivermectin has taken a better seat in this seat in this horse race for me because it works. All the studies so far show that it works in pre-exposure, post-exposure, early, late. Everywhere in the disease cycle, it offers and confers a great benefit. So I'm really a big fan of that treatment right now. So the fact that we see rising hospitalizations and things like that from this right now as a consequence of this second wave of infections, it's very avoidable. Completely, not completely avoidable, but very, very avoidable. So real consequences, especially for the small businesses. Small businesses are closing down like crazy. And remember, we're all sharing in this equally. How about that? You could be forgiven for noticing that the shutdowns and lockdowns mainly target small and medium-sized enterprises, and that the big corporations are actually the beneficiaries and making out very well because none of these corporations are closed down in any way, shape, or form. All right, that's really dour. I do not. This is driving me a little bit nuts. This feels deeply unfair, and I like fairness and all that other stuff. But I think when we're searching for meaning and explanations, this is the best one I've found. I think 2020 has been explained finally. If you saw that monolith that showed up in the desert out there in the United States, now there's no explanation for it. Yeah, I hope there's no virus on the thumb drive. Whoops. I like that one. All right, little humor. Let's keep moving. Remember, I like to keep things straight. So first up, COVID-19 is the disease. SARS-CoV-2 is the virus. Really important distinction because you can have SARS-CoV-2 and not get COVID, the disease. Lots of people are asymptomatic, exposed to the virus, circulates in their body, nothing happens. They never achieve any sort of symptomology and they just clear it without any difficulty. So keep that separate. Two, a case used to mean and should always mean an infected person requiring medical attention. Let me put that back in there. An infected person requiring medical attention is a case, whereas everything else would be an infection, right? So a positive in this case, for the next term down, a positive in the PCR test is kind of meaningless without knowing this cycle threshold, which I'm going to get to in a minute. So it could be an active infection, it could be an old fragment, and they might have circulating fragments of old virus. It could be a false positive. We don't actually know what it means yet. So false positive, those are still a big problem. Especially for low prevalence diseases, and I should have also written in here, especially for really finicky tests where if you contaminate your samples or don't handle it properly, or there's a lot of steps, or you run the temperature of the annealing process at the wrong temperature. There's a lot of reasons you can goof the test up and either get a false positive or a false negative. A negative, if you get a negative PCR test, it's possibly meaningful. Doesn't really indicate if the person had ever been infected or not necessarily. Within a certain window, you probably would always be able to detect if somebody had been infected, but past a certain window, they've cleared the virus, but they may still have circulating antibodies or have T-cell immunity, and we wouldn't know that from the test. So a negative doesn't really tell you anything, for sure. False negatives are problems, but not as big a problem as false positives in this particular case. And then cured or cleared, we don't know what that means really at this point, given that reinfections are a thing. But we don't know what that really stands for yet. What we really care about is this last term, infectious or infective. And this is what we should actually care about most, right? We want to know two things from a COVID test. Do I have the disease in a way that will cause me do I have an infection with the virus that will cause me to develop COVID, the disease, and can I pass it to other people? Those are the things you would want to know. And so I'm going to tell you the things you need to know in order to be able to detect that. All right, remember, these are the things. This is what a good test should tell us, all of these particular things right here. We would like to know them. So let's ask the question if this PCR test for COVID actually does these things for us. First, what is the PCR? It stands for polymerase chain reaction. There are these cycles. What you're looking at here on this graphic shows that there are two little pieces of DNA in there, and they get amplified in this process, and they get turned into 4, and then they get turned into 8, into 16, into 32. It's a doubling cycle. And so after 10 cycles, what we see here is that the signal has been multiplied by 1,000-fold, just over 1,000-fold. And after 20 cycles, it's just over 1 million. After 30 cycles, it's just over 1 billion. After 40 cycles, you've amplified the signal by just over 8 trillion, 1.1 trillion. So roughly 1,000-fold increase in signal for each 10-fold increase in cycles. So what this means is that if you can detect the virus after just 10 cycles, you really got a lot of virus particles in you. And if you can detect it after 20 cycles, you still have a lot of viruses in you. At 30 cycles, starts to get a little iffy. After about 40 cycles, it's probably meaningless. And we're going to discuss why that is. By the way, all this came from the September 1st video titled Bad Testing. And there's the link to it right down there if you want to go back and review this sort of stuff. And this is also from September 1st, to repeat it here, to review it. Cycle threshold is just too damn high. So in July, they noted here this lab identified 794 positive tests based on a threshold of 40 cycles. Wow. And means in Massachusetts, with a cutoff of just 35 cycles, about half the tests would no longer be called positive. So remember, with oh my God, 160,000 cases in the US. But if that's at 40 cycles, and we said, no, the new threshold's 35, that would probably drop to 80,000 cases, right? And if we said the threshold was 30, it would probably drop again by a similar amount. Okay, another half. All right, and about 70% would no longer be judged positive if the cycles were limited to 30, and so on. All right. In Massachusetts, 85 to 90% of people who tested positive in July with a cycle threshold of 40 would have been deemed negative if the threshold were 30 cycles. 85 to 90% if we cut it off at 30. So obviously this is really critical. Where are you drawing the line? Where do you consider somebody COVID positive or SARS-2 positive, right? Well, what do you mean by positive? Can we detect that they ever had the virus, or are we trying to detect if they are infectious? That ought to be the goal here, not to detect who already had been infected or who might be a false positive or anything like that. So the question then comes down to, well, where are you drawing the cutoff and why? So there was a really important piece of work that I also outlined in September, I think back in, when was that? I forget. It's back in May, probably. May or June. And it talked about the strong inverse correlation between SARS-CoV-2 infectivity and cycle threshold value. Let me break that down. An inverse correlation is where one number is going up, another number is going down. A positive correlation, or a correlation, is where one number is going up and another number is going up. So we have crossing numbers in this story. And what they're talking about here is that SARS-CoV-2 infectivity and the cycle thresholds cross. So as the cycle threshold is going up and up and up, the infectivity is going down and down and down. So that's what they're talking about here. And what they found was really fascinating. So in order to test if somebody's actually infective, you swab somebody, you find that the PCR test says, hey, they're positive. You check how many cycles it took to get there, and then they would see if they could culture that virus sample into cells to see if they could actually infect cells. Because if it can't infect cells, it's not a live virus and it's not infectious, and that's the way it goes about it. All right, they found that cycle thresholds above 33 to 34 are not contagious, and that these people could be discharged from hospital care. Fauci even mentioned this, that a cycle threshold of over 35 is probably meaningless, at least from a standpoint of asking or answering the question, am I infectious? Or is this person or party infectious? The answer is above 33, 34, maybe 35, but somewhere in that band, above that level, somebody will test positive, but they're not infectious. They at best have dead virus particles in them. So this seems important, right? Of course it is. Seems very important. Now, a super important paper just came out recently, and a number of you sent this to me, and it's a bunch of scientists, really a bunch of heavy hitters here. These are all very, very established scientists down here. Big, giant list of them. And what they were reviewing was this Corman-Drosten et al. There was a paper that came out suspiciously. It was submitted on January 20th. Before, I think there were only 6 deaths from COVID worldwide. And this paper got submitted saying, oh my gosh, we're going to need this huge ability to test publicly for this COVID thing coming along. It wasn't called COVID at the time. And the paper was accepted by January 21st, 24 hours, barely any time for peer review in there. And these people noticed that when they did the external peer review of this test protocol paper that came out to detect SARS-CoV-2, revealed that it was just riddled with scientific flaws at both the molecular and the methodological levels. And so it had huge consequences for false positives. And they're just basically saying, really poorly done paper, it needs to be retracted. I won't go into all of that right now, but I will say that they had a number of interesting comments in here. And they say it should be noted there is no mention anywhere in the Corman-Drosten paper of a test being positive or negative, or indeed what defines a positive or negative result. So again, where do you draw that line? Where would you say we have a positive case, where's a negative case, right? I'm making the argument that anything from 35 and up ought to be considered negative. And we'll parse that out a little bit more, but generally speaking, anything under 35, hey, that's a positive. So these types of virological diagnostics tests, they say, must be based on an SOP, a standard operating procedure, including a validated and fixed number of PCR cycles, the CT, the cycle threshold values, after which a sample is deemed positive or negative. Positive with a lower number, negative with a higher number, because it's an inverse correlation. The maximum reasonably reliable cycle value is 30 cycles, they say here. Above a CT of 35 cycles, rapidly increasing numbers of false positives must be expected. And these are people who know what they're talking about. These are all experts in this sort of testing. So that's where they're drawing the line. 30, that's conservative. I'm pretty sure that if you're below 30, you have a very positive test there. So they say here, continuing this paper, between 30 and 35 is a gray area where a positive test cannot be established with certainty. This area should be excluded. Of course, one could perform 45 PCR cycles as recommended in this Corman-Drosten WHO protocol, but then you also have to define a reasonable CT value, which should not exceed 30. But an analytical result with a CT value of 45 is scientifically and diagnostically absolutely meaningless. That's very polite science speak. Let me translate science that from out of science speak. Scientifically and diagnostically absolutely meaningless. Garbage. You're garbage. You get readings at 45. It's diagnostically useless because there's nothing you can do with that except to say it's a false positive or this person is no longer infectious at this case. So why you would set the cycle threshold of 45 is very, very bizarre. Because again, we have all this data that says, this is actual data from a lab which says if you culture these things, you can't extract a live virus from a cycle threshold above 33 or 34. That's it. There's no live virus in there anymore. When you're detecting those fragments of virus from above a cycle threshold of 34, you're just detecting dead particles at that point in time. That's the conclusion. That's what the data says. So you would think that in a sane and just society where we're worried about destroying people's livelihoods, or we really actually want to get our arms around what kind of a public health emergency we have, or we want to know where the virus is actively spreading, if you want that level of information, you absolutely have to know the cycle thresholds. They ought to be reported on a daily basis, but they're really not. So I said 45, Nobody would do 45. They must have mistyped something. So I went to the WHO/PCR test instructions, just downloaded it today on December 1st. This is where it is that, you can, all the links, of course, are down below in the description down there below this if you want to track them down. And sure enough, actually, they have one cycle of the reverse transcription, then they have another cycle of initial denaturation, and then 45. They're recommending 45 cycles. The WHO is 45. That's scientifically indefensible. I can't find any explanation for why you would want to have a cycle threshold at 45 when, again, if we said 35 is where we would cut it off for sure, and Fauci says above 35, probably not infectious. But you go to 45, remember that's 1,000-fold amplification from there to there. So your people who might be 1,000 times below any infectious limit, 1,000 times are still being dinged as positives under this test protocol. So remember, tests show that live SARS-CoV-2, it cannot be cultured from stuff where the cycle threshold was 35 or greater. Thus, anything over 35, anything, absolutely has to be confirmed with clinical symptoms to be declared a positive. You can't just say our swab came back with a positive at a CT of 37 or 39 or 40 or 45 and call that a positive, because it's a meaningless, positive what? It's a meaningless number. So here's how you interpret this stuff. Remember, I told you there was one question that you were gonna ask. If you get a SARS-CoV-2 positive test, your first question back to your healthcare provider, your lab, whoever that is, wherever you got that result from, is to say, at what cycle threshold was I positive? Because if you have a positive PCR result with a cycle threshold of 30 or lower here, you got to treat this. You got to treat it accordingly. You got to get on many of the, if you're on an outpatient basis, all the outpatient treatments we've been talking about so far, those would be things you would absolutely want to get your hands on as soon as possible. The EVMS protocol would be a great one. More broadly speaking, ivermectin, selenium, vitamin D, things like that would be very, very helpful to get on in zinc right away. A CT between 30 and 35 is increasingly suspect. It may indicate an active infection or maybe an inactive one. It might be a false positive. So you would want to take prophylactic measures if you had a CT between 30 and 35, but I personally wouldn't be worrying too much. You have a much lower level of that infection. Remember, the amount of viral load you have determines how sick you get. That's a positive correlation. The more virus you get, the worse your COVID symptoms are going to be. So if you had a cycle threshold at like 12, dude, you're going to have a bad run at this thing. 17, this is not going to be cool. 20 even, 25. By the time you get to 30, you have a lot less viral load in you. By the time you get to 35, probably not that much. So I would say any cycle threshold between 35 and 40 is increasingly noisy, that is useless. It might be that you're asymptomatic. It might be that you've gotten over it. It might be at the very, very early stages, so there's a small possibility of that too. But unless clinical symptoms are present, there's really nothing to worry about here at this level either. And any CT positive result over 40, I would call complete garbage, or more gently, scientifically and diagnostically meaningless. And the WHO's test standard with a CT of 45, that would be beyond garbage. We would be one step further, or 5 full steps further. So this is how you would interpret this. If I got a positive test result, my first question is, at what cycle? What's my cycle threshold? Where was that detected? I need to know that. So that's really important data. And if that doesn't come back with your test, it's just positive or negative, it's not a good test, it's not a good lab. You should know the cycle thresholds. That should be known. In fact, that ought to be reported all over the place. We would like to know if on average, where we see cases, or where they're calling cases, but are actually detected infections, we'd like to know what's the average cycle threshold of those, because that gives us a sense of where we are. If the average is at 30, like, geez, that's a raging infection probably in your area. If it's 40, who cares, right? All right, the UK has a PCR. Their positive standards here, they say any positive result will be recorded as confirmed for public health reporting purposes and will be notifiable under recent legislation. However, results where the CT value is over 40 or there is an abnormal assay curve that means the test got blown, and or the clinical context makes the positive result highly unexpected. Should be considered interim or held until reviewed by a laboratory clinician. And then, well, the laboratory clinician might say, well, I still think it's a positive for reasons X, Y, and Z, but that's it. Anything up to a cycle threshold of 40 in the UK is a positive, and that includes a lot of cases that go well beyond the 35 threshold, obviously. The U.S. States set their own limits. There's a federal minimum of cycle threshold of 38, but here we see Kansas set a CT cutoff of 42, and they say any specimen that has a CT below the cutoff for the test is most likely a true positive. So they're pretty certain about this. A true positive for what though? True positive that you detected SARS-CoV-2, or true positive for a disease that's infectious and capable of turning somebody into a hospital victim? That level of subtlety really ought to be understood by this time in the game. The FDA, their cycle threshold is 40, so that's their cutoff level there. So that's where we're at. So this is really just it's just disappointing that these sorts of, cycle thresholds ought to have been something that was explained. It ought to be on the news. We ought to have access to this number. Your healthcare provider ought to have the sophistication to know about it. It ought to be that whenever somebody gets a positive test, that's the first question back. Where are we in this cycle threshold? Because if you're below 30 and if you're below 20, get treatment right away. Hurry right away. So this is it has important clinical outcomes. And we should know these sorts of things. All right. The final questions for the day, though, is this: so why aren't these cycle threshold results disclosed as a routine part of information flow and decision making? Really ought to be. But now you know about them. That's the one question you really need to ask and answer if you get a positive test, PCR test that is, not the antibody test that they're doing. But if you get a positive PCR test, what is my cycle threshold value? You got to know that. That'll help you determine your next course of action, tell you how worried or not you ought to be about this thing. And that's the state of the world we're in right now. So remember, it's important, because if you're going to go into lockdowns and small and medium-sized businesses are going to be absolutely crushed by this, that really shouldn't be happening for no reason at all. There has to be a really well-defined, very crisp reason, a very crisp public emergency that needs to be there. And by the way, again, I don't really think there would be such a huge public emergency if we were preparing the terrain and using the outpatient treatments that we've been talking about for many months. They exist. They're there. Healthcare providers, you really got to get up the curve on this stuff. Follow the EVMS protocol if you want it from other healthcare providers. Otherwise, check out all the data that exists out there on ivermectin, on Dwizabin, that drug which shall not be named, on vitamin D, and things like melatonin, famotidine, etc. There are tons and tons of over-the-counter outpatient things that can be done to really help limit the spread of the disease in someone's body and the progression of the disease in someone's body. So, hey, that's all I have for today. I hope you learned something. If you like this and you found it useful, please hit the like button down below. Small ask, smash it. Like Hulk, smash it. And otherwise, I will see you next time. Thanks for listening. It's been great. Talk to you next time. Bye.